I'll introduce you to the various participants. Something seems to have gone wrong and I've lost my screen share. Just give me a moment. If you'll just excuse me for a second. Something that somebody has just done. One of our staff have somehow disabled my ability to control Zoom. Right, I think we're back again. Right, so I'm just going to introduce the various people on the panel. First of all is Dr. Mike Posthumus, who is the head of high performance at the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. He's also a partner coach at Science to Sport, has a PhD in exercise science, and is a very accomplished cyclist in the field of mountain bike marathoning. John Wakefield is also a partner coach at Science to Sport and is head of coaching and performance coordinator at UAE Team Emirates, one of the top 3 teams in world cycling. Then the third panelist is myself. I'm the medical director at UAE Team Emirates, but also a long-standing coach, Olympic coach for 2012, and also sports physician and exercise scientist at UCT and the Sports Science Institute in Newlands. We've got Benoit Ben Capostagno, who's a sports scientist. He's currently completing his PhD also at the University of Cape Town and is also a partner coach with Science to Sport. And then lastly, joining us today for the first time is Reece McDonald, who's an associate coach at Science to Sport, and he's currently completing his master's degree in exercise science at the University of Cape Town, and is also an elite rowing coach, but now is highly involved in cycling coaching through Science to Sport and coaches a number of top athletes. So what we're going to do, just to give you an idea of how the proceedings are going to commence, is we've received all of your questions from the emails and through the link that we published. We've collated all those questions and assigned them to the various delegates, and we will be answering those for the first 60 minutes. After that, we're going to open the floor to any questions that you might have, and we'll answer those sequentially until everybody gets bored and wants to leave. So probably another 30 or 40 minutes of open floor Q&A. And I would like to ask you, just before you post your questions, first of all, post them in the Q&A tab, or if you're following on Facebook Live, you can post them in Facebook. They'll be referred through to us onto the Zoom Q&A tab, and I'll be able to see them there. And please wait until about 10 minutes before the end of the normal question session, because some of your questions may otherwise be answered in that. So at about 4:15 South African time, you can start posting questions, and then we'll be able to attend to those questions when we get to that part of the session. So let's kick things off. The first question we received is, what are good recovery strategies between training sessions, for instance, in a 6-day week of training? And the first person who's going to answer that is Ben Capostagno.
Right, thanks, Doc. Let me just bring up my screen here. Okay, so the question is, what are good recovery strategies between training sessions for someone training 6 days a week? So in other words, someone who's training quite regularly, how do they basically maximize their recovery to make sure that they don't get fatigued as they progress through their training block, as it were? Now, recovery is obviously an incredibly important part of training, basically, no matter what sport it is. And really the purpose of recovery is to get us back to an ability where we can go again, essentially. So we want to make sure that between key or our hard, really, really hard sessions, that we've recovered sufficiently so that we're going to be able to deliver on those sessions and hit our target intensities. Now, recovery is obviously, from a sports science point of view and a sporting industry point of view, is big business. There's lots of companies that promote different recovery strategies. Some of the more common ones in the modern era are recovery boots. Well, they call them boots. They're more like pants, really, that fill up with air and provide graduated compression. There's compression garments. They even now sort of handheld devices that you can use to sort of self-massage your legs and the rest of your body as well. in order to promote recovery. But like with anything related to cycling training or training in general and performance, really, if you're not doing the basics right, you can forget about those other ones. So what are the basics? We're going to focus on 2 of them now. And the first one is sleep. Really, I think if you ask any sort of high-level athlete, what is the best sort of method or their best strategy for improving recovery, sleep is probably at the top of that list. So sleep is really a critical aspect of recovery. It allows us to make sure that our body has time to recover and adapt to the training stress that we've sort of imposed on it, and also provides us with not only a physical recovery, but also a mental recovery. If our sleep isn't good, then we generally feel quite run down. Often we're more prone to infections because of our immune systems have been compromised. So sleep is really something that is very, very important. And of course, our need for sleep increases with increases in training load. So the more training we do, the more or the greater our need for good quality sleep becomes apparent. So how can we improve our sleep, or what strategies can we employ to improve our sleep? Avoid or reduce our alcohol intake. I'm going to be the last person to tell you not to have a beer or a glass of wine with dinner if you want one, but try not to have alcohol too close to basically your bedtime. Be cautious with caffeine. The reason I say be cautious is because there's large individual variability in terms of how people respond to caffeine. So if you're someone who typically trains later in the afternoon or early evening, and you've got a particularly hard session, maybe you pop a gel during the session and the gel has some caffeine in, or you're using caffeine pills to help you with the session, just be careful on the timing of that if you're particularly sensitive to caffeine, because it could delay your sleep onset later in the evening. Other people are, like myself, are not really sensitive to caffeine at all, which is like a bit of a disappointment more than anything. So we can't, we could have a double espresso and go to bed. It doesn't matter. So if you are particularly sensitive to caffeine, then try and limit your intake close to bedtime. Then hydration. This is also a key one. Obviously, you want to hydrate appropriately after exercise, particularly nowadays if you've been doing a lot of your sessions indoors. You tend to lose a lot of fluid, so you want to try and replace that fluid as part of your recovery strategy. But you don't want to be getting up, a couple of times in the night to go to the bathroom because you've hydrated a little bit too much. So just keep an eye on that. Skin temperature is an easy one, and basically will vary according to the seasons. So as we're heading into winter here in the Southern Hemisphere, some of us might like to take a warm shower just before we go to bed in order to warm our skin in a cool environment. And in summer, sometimes having a cooler shower or a cold shower when it's warm outside helps us to reduce our skin temperature and helps with sleep onset as well. Then sticking to regular sleep and wake time, so going to bed roughly the same time each night and making sure that you get up at the same time every night. The next one's a tough one. Reducing screen time. I think these days with access to our smartphones, and many of us are working later in the evening now, and sitting behind laptops and other and iPads, etc. The blue light from the screens can delay our sleep or affect our sleep quality. You do get apps these days that can reduce that blue light, or you can even purchase glasses that help reduce the effect of that blue light as well. So that's something to look into. And make sure your room is dark as possible and quiet. And then another one that I'm not very good at, but just avoid using the snooze button in the morning. When your alarm goes off, try and get up immediately. Having that extra 5 minutes or 10 minutes lie-in does not improve your quality or quantity of your sleep, unfortunately. So that's sleep. And then the other aspect that I wanted to just touch on was that of nutrition. Okay, from a recovery point of view, nutrition is vital to your recovery. So there's a couple of boxes we want to tick with our nutrition following a training session. We want to make sure that we refuel adequately. So we're replenishing the fuel stores that we've lost. Those of you who were on the webinar last Friday would have seen Mike's talk where he spoke about sort of energy consumption and how to work out what you need to be refueling with. Rehydration, which you spoke about earlier, just a reminder there, be cautious, make sure you don't overdo it so that you're getting up, throughout the night to go for a wee. And then obviously nutrition should promote adaptation. We've just applied this stress or dose of exercise to the body. Make sure that we have the sufficient nutrients and building blocks to allow the body to recover from that stress. And then immune support as well. Jeroen answered a question last week regarding fasted sessions and whether or not they affect our immune system. So they can. So make sure that you don't have a negative energy balance too often following your training, just to make sure that your immune system is not compromised. And then as soon as possible, after a hard session or race, preferably within that first hour, try and get in a recovery meal or drink of some sort. And the reason for that is in that first hour, your body is a little bit more receptive to those nutrients. So it can take them up a little bit better and replenish your glycogen stores. And then obviously the protein can be used as well. So what should you aim for from a nutrition point of view following a particularly hard session? Obviously, we want a mix of carbohydrate and protein, good qualities of each, obviously. The carbohydrate is there to restore your glycogen stores, to make sure that your fuel tank's basically ready for the next session. And the protein is there for protein synthesis to help us rebuild our muscle if we've had a particularly damaging session, or to prevent a catabolic state where we're going to break down soft tissue in our bodies. So from a carbohydrate point of view, approximately 1 gram per kilogram of body mass of carbohydrate, and then protein about 0.3 grams of body mass, per kilogram of body mass of protein. And again, a good source of protein would be a whey isolate, for example, or as a protein hydrolysate. So those are really the two aspects that I would encourage people to focus on from a recovery strategy for someone who is training fairly regularly. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. We'll just wait for you to unshare your screen for us.
Sorry.
Correct. Right. The second question is, does block periodization work? Is it good to do blocks, for example, of 3 weeks on and 1 off for recovery in the 4th week, or do 4 to 5 weeks and then recover? And Dr. Mike Posthumus is going to answer that question for us. Are you there, Mike? Mike, I think your mic is muted. If you can unmute yourself, then we can hear you.
Apologies for that. Sorry, I must just get control here. So thank you very much for the question on periodization. And we had quite a few questions on periodization. So I thought I'll answer the question, but just sort of delved into a little bit of periodization with this opportunity. So the question really was whether 3+1 or 4+1, what is the best mix? And they refer to block periodization. So I thought I'll provide a little bit of clarity. What is periodization? So periodization is the systematic planning of a short-term and long-term training program through the implementation of variations in intensity, volume, and frequency. Now, there are several ways in which you can do that. And here is an example of a classical sort of periodization structure that we use with cyclists that works extremely well. And you can see this example uses in this first phase. We would emphasize a general preparation. Last week, we talked a lot about talk intervals. I like doing, and we like doing them really early on. And here, for example, we did 3+1. Then we did 4 weeks of aerobic emphasis and a rest. Then stepping up the intensity, you can see the intensity in the red here as we start decreasing the volume in these next 2 blocks. And this real final phase is the real high intensity work where we are further decreasing the volume as we approach our key event. Now, this is following all the sort of key periodization principles. When we talk block periodization, the term is used widely. When we talk about block periodization, we sort of talk about organizing our key workouts into these blocks or mesocycles, as you see here. And each mesocycle can be between 2 and 4 weeks. And they are traditionally, we use specific targeted workouts within each of these blocks. So in this first block, we will emphasize torque work, etc., as we move along. Now, periodization has been challenged. And more recently, this article that I'll show you has challenged the concept. Now, it's important to recognize what has been challenged. So what has been challenged is the fact that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It's important to remember that we all individuals, when given the same training session, we are all going to respond differently, and that it's very important to consider individual responses in a training program. So yes, the one-size-fits-all approach of periodization, that is debunked. But when we use periodization, and this example of an athlete, and Jeroen might talk later on the performance management chart, this is a very nice example where we can see our different training blocks. So here we used 4 weeks and 1 week rest, 4 weeks and 1 week rest. We used all this data with chatting to the athlete, with recording their wellness data to ensure that there is progression over this period. So it is important to consider the athlete and not just apply a formula approach when prescribing training. So a key element here when you look at this performance management chart is to ensure that they become fresh. And you can see they become fresh here with this little spike in their training stress balance, which I'm sure we'll cover a little bit later. So just thought, as we are talking periodization, just 2 slides on a really great study that was published recently. And this was a study that showed which is the best sort of, how do you best structure a periodized approach? So what we do is we generally go from a low intensity to a high intensity. So what this study did was, yes, they did that from a really low intensity to a high intensity. That is the increasing intensity group. They did it opposite way around, a decrease intensity group. And then they did 16 weeks of just mixed training where they mixed all the different sessions up and they try to see which is the best way, how best, which of these periodized models works the best. So basically, and people also use this, and this is why I wanted to mention the study, because people use this as a proof that periodization does not work, because all 3 models improved. If you look at the variables, the change in 40-kilometer time trial, the change in PPO and change in VO2 max, everybody increased. But this graph I showed here is a key takeout for me from this study. So if you look at the percentage in white here of people that did not respond to the training, which model would you rather do? Which would you rather use on your athletes? And if you're an athlete, which would you rather perform? I myself, I would like to reduce the chance of not responding. So if you look at 15% versus sort of 38 and 44, I would back my chances and go for the increase intensity group. So this is my takeout from this. You can see when you look at the magnitude of changes, you can see that you're probably far better off looking to increase your intensity as we do and as I showed in that first slide I shared. So basically, it's a long answer to, which could have been a very short question. We like doing 4+1, but there is no right and wrong when it comes to periodization.
Thanks, Mike. So the next question is directed to me, and that is the performance management chart on Training Peaks, which Mike just showed you a few seconds ago. Can you please explain how best to use those measurements to get your top fitness? For example, what should the weekly TSS score be? What is a good CTL to have? And what is the best TSB to have on race day? So I'll just give you a little bit of background to that. The PMC actually comes out of the work by Thomas Calvert and Eric Bannister in the early 80s, where they decided to mathematically model fitness and fatigue. And they, for some reason which hasn't been made apparent, decided that they would use a period of about 42 days for fitness as sort of a moving average, and fatigue 7 days. And they then compared the relationship between training load in those 2 different durations to performance in swimmers and later in runners, and showed that there was a beneficial effect of having the optimal balance between the two. What do we mean by that? If you look at the PMC, it takes into account various different variables such as power, heart rate, running speed, or otherwise, or RPE even, to generate a training stress score. And the training stress score is an arbitrary unit. And basically, the way it works is that 100 training stress score units are equivalent to doing 60 minutes of exercise at your functional threshold power. And this is just the original one, but now they've incorporated many other variables as well. Your CTL is your chronic training load, and the chronic training load is the 42-day moving average of your weighted score based on power. So above your FTP, you score more TSS units incrementally, so it's exponentially weighted, and below less, so it's an exponential scoring. And if you want to know where that scoring came from, it's a modification of Carl Foster's heart rate TRIMPS scores, which he originally developed for heart rate to weight those. And then, as I said, your CTL is a 42-day moving average of your average daily TSS scores, and the acute training load, which is your ATL, is a 7-day moving average. You can actually change these values in the software, whether you're using Golden Cheetah, which has a version of the PMC, or Training Peaks or WKO. You can change that according to experience that you've had with an individual athlete. Some athletes recover faster, some lose fitness slower, some gain fitness faster, and so forth. And training stress balance is simply the difference between the two. So CTL minus ATL. So your PMC typically looks like this. This is the blue line, that's your chronic training load, your CTL. And that, as you can see, is here in TSS units per day. And that will go up progressively over time. And on a 7-day moving average, which Mike showed in those weeks, the training load goes up and down. The difference between the two gives you this negative or positive value, which is your training stress balance, which is on this scale here, and be positive or negative. So that's your TSB. What should you aim for? Well, if we look at how well these things correlate to true internal, so this is external training load metrics. In other words, it's the work done, but it doesn't measure how your body responds to that work. So your own characteristics, for instance, performance, your subjective perception of fatigue, your heart rate, etc., are what we call internal load metrics. And we have to look at them and see whether they compare to the external load metrics, the PMC. So this is data from UAE Team Emirates. And if we look here, the change in CTL from pre-season to in-season correlates quite highly with an average change in mean maximal power for durations from 1 minute up to 60 minutes in duration. So we can see this linear relationship. So as you improve in fitness, you become faster, which is self-evident. What is the maximum CTL that you should try to aim for? And that's a difficult question to answer, and it's dependent on the individual athlete. For instance, in younger athletes, junior athletes, or age group athletes, for instance, who work during the day, junior athletes haven't developed to their full physical capacity yet. There we would aim for much lower CTL values, because above those values, they would otherwise fall ill, or they would get injured, or they may develop an overtraining syndrome. And so a CTL range for somebody in the junior years or in the age group years could vary from anywhere from 70 to maybe 110. If we look at top professional road riders who do, for instance, grand tours, we would look at a range from 110 up to maybe 140. That would be a typical range. So it depends on the individual characteristics of the athlete. Does that training stress balance, so the balance between acute and chronic load, tell us about how fatigued athletes are? Well, here's self-reported fatigue scores, which we do on a weekly basis with the team. And this is your training stress balance as recorded by the PMC. And you can see there is actually a little bit of a correlation, but it's a weak correlation. There's an R value of 0.3, even though it is statistically significant with a p-value below 0.05. but the correlation is not that strong. And the reason why that's the case is there is more than just your training load that goes into fatigue. Fatigue is dependent on, as Ben pointed out, your nutrition, your sleeping habits, many other factors, and your own individual characteristics in terms of how you respond to the training session. This is composite wellness. So this is a mixture of scores such as fatigue, how well you've slept, stress, and so forth. And if we look at composite wellness, it doesn't correlate at all with the TSB value. There's no relationship. It's basically just random scatter, and it's not significant in terms of the p-value. So your overall well-being is not really dependent on your acute versus your chronic training load, because so many other factors actually go into that. And lastly, what sort of TSB is good for performance? Once again, we see that there's generally this scatter pattern. So these are 5-minute mean maximal power output bests. These are 20-minute bests, and these are 60-minute bests across a 6-month duration for a number of different athletes, and when they were able to achieve those bests. And as you can see, the TSB could range from anywhere, and this is obviously in a Grand Tour, for instance. This is at minus 60 TSB, which is heavily fatigued according to the PMC, but you could still sometimes produce a maximal effort, and all the way to the other end of the chart. One of the key performance determinants is how many Haribos you eat. As you can see, me and Tadej Pogačar both like our Haribos, and they have an additional beneficial effect on performance. That's during the Vuelta after he won his 3rd stage. Back to the PMC. So as you can see, the TSB doesn't really affect your best performances, but generally, we try to have an athlete enter a race or a key event at a training load that doesn't result in them entering the race in a fatigued state. And you can, to some extent, predict that by looking at these TSB values. And we try to aim for a TSB value slightly into the positive range. Why slightly into the positive range? We don't want somebody to be over-rested, because once you rest past a particular point, you start to lose some of your training adaptations and performance starts to drop off. So this particular PMC has also an additional value here, which is your ramp rate. That tells you on this side how many TSS units the CTL value is ramping up in any given week. And generally, if you're using that, I would stick to a range of somewhere between 5 and 10 during a time of overload, so that you're not overloading excessively, which is what's happening here, where this is hitting well above 10. So this is a very rapid ramp up, and hence you can see the TSB is very negative. And you don't want to ramp up too slowly, because you'll run out of time before the actual event and you won't have reached peak performance. So that's an additional factor that you can look at. Right. The next question is directed at John Wakefield, and that is, what were the main challenges you faced when you began to work with the UAE Team Emirates in terms of improving team performance and its place in the world rankings? Over to you, John.
Thanks, Jeroen. Just let me get everything up here quickly. Welcome back, everyone. And yeah, as Jeroen had said, what were our main challenges that were faced when we began working with UAE, and what we sort of had implemented to improve their performance. When we joined the team, they had finished the previous year in 15th place on world rankings, which is pretty close to relegation, down to Pro Conti. And what we had found once we were sort of employed was that they had employed an additional new staff complement of about 10 new staff. And when you looked at who those staff were and the positions they held, they were really experts at their given position. So what sort of, for me personally, and when I spoke to Jeroen a little bit, was the first thing was trying to find, on a team of 80 staff, you need to build a relationship and you need to trust one another, especially when you have no idea who they are. The language barrier was quite strong, with it being predominantly an Italian team and a really strong Italian culture. So that alone really posed some interesting scenarios at the best of times. then when it really came down to the performance side, it was taking those previous protocols and implementations that they had and sort of sifting through what didn't work, and the ones that didn't work, we obviously had to discard and implement our own new protocols, which is pretty much about 90% of what we had done. The element from that came in was, because, believe it or not, World Tour stuff is still very kind of old school. It was introducing something completely left field to a team. And for them to buy into it was one of our biggest problems. Asking them to do an SFT test when they saw no kind of genuine reason why they needed to do it. So once we had started collecting data and showing stuff to them, then it started coming around and sort of more trust was built. Where I think one of the biggest parts came in, especially for myself, was trying to find your place within the team. When you got all these 8 personalities in the team, everyone is a little bit of an expert in everyone else's field. So the role that essentially is assigned to you, which for myself was at the start just coaching, and then it became performance coordinator and coaching coordinator, etc. It was quite hard then being sort of criticized in a way and having to kind of bat off questions and making sure that you don't do the same when you see another gentleman in performance or another sporting director make a call on something where you have a sort of totally separate opinion to it. But again, you needed to respect them for who they are, what they've achieved, and understand that what they are implementing is right because they are an expert at what they do. Once sort of everyone, which is probably 3 months into the new year, and everyone started trusting and realizing that everyone did know what they were doing, it really became a well-oiled machine. Things were probably, I would probably say 85% implemented and executed that everyone in their department had done. And from that, for next year already, we've already got mandates on changes coming into 2021 and some positions of staff moving around when you find out that they are a little bit better in a certain department than where they are currently. And we ended the year off finishing 4th in the world rankings, which was the highest jump of any of the teams. We kind of, I believe, sort of excelled a little bit too much, because this year, essentially, we were meant to go for number 1. Prior to COVID and everything kicking in, I think we were first for a while on the world rankings, and then we had fallen down to 2nd. And obviously next year, because of COVID, our expectations are really big from the big bosses and from the general manager. So it's now coming down to next year, sort of much of the same, but just a lot more refined in what we do and just tackling it a lot more closer. But that was definitely some of the highlights of trying to fit into essentially a 79-man squad, and you're the 80th person and dealing with everyone. That's it.
Thanks, John.
Cool.
The next question is directed at Reece. And the question is, I coach a few people in their 50s and 60s, most of which have been cycling for less than 10 years, but are currently competitive in their respective age categories. I found that they take longer to recover from intense training sessions than younger athletes of a similar strength. With this in mind, would you suggest I prescribe fewer weekly key sessions for these athletes, or should I change the structure of their key sessions? Over to you, Reece.
Thanks, Jeroen. Okay. There we go. Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and it's particularly relevant to a lot of athletes. You probably get quite a few athletes who were really good when they were younger, and now they did well because they were just talented, and now they're progressing into sort of more competitive age categories. Or you'll get people who've just started riding at an older age. And obviously, as a coach, knowing how to handle and deal with this is important. So I think this question is very relevant. So I think there are two aspects that I'd probably focus on. The first especially if you're following a sort of well-structured program already, is looking at optimizing your their adaptation and recovery. And there are three sort of aspects to this. And what's nice is that Ben's already touched on some of this and the more specific details. But firstly, it's fueling. Obviously, pre-session, you need to make sure that your athletes are fueled, especially if they're doing interval sessions. Starting a session on not eating for 4 or 5 hours isn't really going to produce the type of quality you want in 10, 30-second intervals. So having adequate pre-session glycogen stores is very important. And then obviously during the session, ensuring that the athletes are fueling correctly. So ideally using a 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate drink during the session, just so they can maintain their fueling stores throughout the session and complete the session correctly without dropping quality. And then obviously post, so immediately after the session or within that first 30 minutes to an hour, ensuring that there's a 1-to-4 ratio of protein to carbohydrates. Then in addition to that, recovery strategies. So one of those strategies is foam rolling and stretching. Foam rolling or self-myofascial release has been shown to produce good results in terms of recovery. Obviously, that's sort of mixed in some studies, and the jury is still sort of out on that one. But I would suggest that it's probably an avenue to explore if it might potentially work. As Mike sort of said with his periodization as well, you kind of want to go with something that's probably the most logical. And then strength training on top of that. So especially in older people, sarcopenia is quite prevalent, and there have been positive endurance events or sort of benefits shown with strength training. I'm not talking about Kate Courtney balancing balls and throwing wine glasses around. I'm just talking about simple general strength exercises that would obviously improve and condition yourself to performing your movements correctly. Then the second one is session prescription and feedback. So firstly, as a coach, if you're prescribing intervals and you worry that your athlete might not be recovering, I would suggest potentially allowing longer recovery between the intervals. So making sure that they're probably following a 1-to-1 interval to recovery ratio, just making sure that they're not hitting the session too fatigued in the beginning, or especially towards the end of the session, they've had enough recovery throughout. And then looking at shorter interval duration. So keeping your intervals under 10 minutes, not going for 3 15 minutes, 3 20 minutes, that's going to build a huge amount of fatigue and mentally as well, and it's quite a tough task to execute, especially if you're probably a working individual. And this just goes down to looking at quality over quantity. So making sure that when you're prescribing intervals, are these intervals focusing on adaptation, or is it just a mixed bag of so much that there's just going to be a struggle to complete the session? Then, which I think is quite important and often overlooked, is looking at group or weekend social rides. So I would suggest probably structuring the week around those. Generally, we all want to ride with our mates and have fun. And Saturdays are normally a lot of climbing, longer rides, and these can actually produce quite a significant amount of fatigue. So making sure that if you're prescribing sessions, these are well worked around this. You don't want them to be doing an intense interval session on the Friday and then going to do a long group ride on the Saturday. So this is something I would suggest structuring around. And then, of course, as Mike mentioned, periodization, probably moving to a 3 on, 1 off approach, which I found works really well with working individuals. It just allows enough stress and then recovery at a continuous cycle. Obviously, there are going to be periods such as December when 4 weeks might work, but obviously factoring in their working stress and daily life stress, and understanding that there's going to be a continuum, and you want that continuum. You want them to continuously train and adapt, not train hard for a little bit and then have to tap off for 2-3 weeks because they're just absolutely smashed. And then one of the last ones to this is just monitoring. So simple feedback is really important, such as them just leaving session RPE on their rides. And you can obviously look at this and assess if the RPE is super high for a recovery ride, for instance, or if the RPE is too low or high for an interval session. And then just asking them weekly or even bi-weekly how they're feeling, and then understanding if they are recovering enough. So hopefully all these factors are enough to give you some insight into what you could probably change. But I was just probably changing a few things at a time and not going for everything at once, because obviously then you're not really going to be able to properly understand what worked or didn't work. Thank you.
Thanks, Reece. Back to you, Ben. And the question is, how can the LSCT, so for those of you who don't know what that is, the Lamberts and Lamberts submaximal cycling test, which we offer athletes on a weekly basis, roughly, as an assessment of their internal and external load metrics, how can that be used for adapting training load?
Thanks, Jeroen. Just bring this up quickly. Make sure my mic is on. I think I'll need my laser pointer for this one. Okay, so thanks, Doc. So how can the LSCT be used for adapting training load? It's pretty clear from even from just today's presentations that cycling scientists generally love an acronym. You've probably just got your head around your PMC, looking at your TSB, and now we throw in an LSCT. So let's just look at what that is first. So what is the LSCT? Well, the acronym stands for the Lamberts and Lamberts Submaximal Cycle Test. And this was a submaximal protocol that was designed to serve as a warm-up to be done fairly regularly in a cyclist's training program in order to monitor their training adaptation and fatigue levels. And if you missed the previous seminars 2 weeks ago, you wouldn't have seen this. So this is just basically a graphical breakdown of what the LSCT looks like. So what it consists of is 3 stages at set submaximal heart rates. The first stage is 6 minutes at 60% of maximal heart rate. And at the end of, or the last 30 seconds of the stage, we take a rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. We essentially ask the cyclist, how hard does it feel to ride at this specific heart rate intensity? And all the while we are measuring submaximal power output here as well. We then go to stage 2, which is 6 minutes at 80% of our maximal heart rate. Again, at the end of the stage, just recording an RPE. And the third stage is 3 minutes at 90% of maximal heart rate. Again, we're taking an RPE. After that third stage, we ask the cyclist to sit upright, relax, and recover for a period of about 90 seconds. And that allows us to record a 60-minute heart rate recovery, which is essentially the number of beats in the heart rate decreases in that 60-minute period from 60 seconds, period following that third stage. So that is the LSCT. So really what it is it's a test or a submaximal protocol that allows us to monitor the interplay between heart rate, power output, and perception of effort, a subjective rating of intensity. How hard does this feel? Okay, so how can we use it to adapt training load? Well, the very first study that we got published from my PhD looked at this exact question, is can we use the LSCT to adapt high intensity training prescription in order to improve performance or ensure a better adaptation? So what we did is we took 2 groups of cyclists. We had a structured group that came in and they underwent the training protocol as it was planned without any consideration for their fatigue. So it was 4 high intensity sessions over a 2-week period, so not a particularly long or strenuous block of training, but the sessions were definitely tough. And before each session, they performed an LSCT, and we were going to use that to see if we could predict their changes in performance. So that was a structured group. They came in, and if by the time they were there for their 3rd session, they were like, gee, I'm really quite tired. We were like, well, that's too bad. Anyway, enjoy the ride. And then we had a second group, a flexible group. And the flexible group, what we did is we adjusted the timing of their high intensity sessions based on the data from the submaximal test. So effectively, if we saw something that indicated maybe fatigue, we gave them an extra rest day, and then they would come back a couple of days later and we would see if they were ready for the session. So some people in the flexible group, they underwent basically a protocol that looked something like this. They were able to handle the training load, and they did not need to be adjusted in terms of having a session postponed. And then others came in, and let's say, like for example, on this one here, they were supposed to come in for a high intensity session, but the LSCT data showed that they were maybe a bit too fatigued. So we sent them home to rest. They came back a couple of days later, and then they were ready to perform that high intensity session. So that was the flexible group. The three criteria that we used in this particular study to look at whether or not we wanted to adjust training were an increase in RPE on stage 2. So basically riding at 80% of their maximal heart rate felt harder than it usually does. Okay, so even if it was just one score higher on the RPE chart, we still basically counted that as one criteria. If they failed to reach the stage 3 heart rate, so during periods of acute fatigue and even sort of chronic fatigue, or sort of overreaching, functional overreaching, it can be quite difficult to reach 90% of your maximal heart rate. So if they were unable to reach that stage in the first minute, we counted that as another criteria. And if we saw a change in their heart rate recovery of more than 2 beats, either up or down, and direction didn't matter if it was an increase or a decrease, any change greater than 2 beats in their heart rate recovery was another criteria. If they were positive for any 2 of those 3 criteria, they missed the session for that day, and it was basically postponed to 2 days later. Okay, and then they would come in and basically repeat the process. Did it work? Well, it wasn't. Unfortunately, it wasn't a home run, but we did show that the structured group improved their 40-kilometer time trial, which is a really good test for endurance performance, by more than the structured group. So the flexible group are these guys in the white columns, and the structured group are these guys here in the filled columns, or the black columns. And we can see that basically we had greater improvements in our flexible group compared to the structured group. But unfortunately, we had 2 riders in our flexible group who didn't show an improved performance. So anything, this gray bar represents the normal day-to-day variation of 40-kilometer time trial time. So any performance that's within this gray bar is basically counted as the same as it was previously. So these guys actually, they didn't improve or get worse. So they sort of didn't really respond to the high intensity training. And then in our structured group, structured group, interestingly enough, these 2 green arrows, so these 2 riders, they were able to improve their 40-kilometer time trial time greater than that day-to-day, the smallest meaningful difference. So what we did then is we did a follow-up study where we basically switched them. We took these 2 guys and added them to this group, and then took these guys out, and we looked at if there were any clues in the submaximal data as to who, as to why these 2 didn't perform and these 2 did. And the one variable apart from heart rate recovery, which we already knew was a very good predictor of an improved training status that tended to show a positive correlation, was stage 2 power. So there might be a clue in that one, and that's something we are basically further investigating at the moment. But we always go back to this sort of matrix, as it were, in terms of helping us guide how to handle training load, or adapting training load based on the relationship between heart rate, power, and perception of effort. And it doesn't have to be in the LSTT per se. Doc and John have already mentioned our SFT that we use, which is a similar concept, except we fix power output rather than heart rate. And essentially, if your heart rate feels pretty normal and responsive, like as you change in the gears, as you're getting up to your target intensities, it tends to respond quite quickly, and you're able to reach your target intensities fairly quickly without much problem. No changes really in the power output at that heart rate, and the perception of effort doesn't change either. It feels pretty much the same it does. If our heart rate is normal and responsive, but maybe we're producing a little bit more power output at the same heart rate, but it doesn't feel any harder to ride at that intensity, that's probably a positive sign of adaptation. However, then we start to get into the bottom 2, where things start to go a little bit wonky, where our heart rate maybe is a bit more sluggish. So it's not really responding at the same rate it usually does. It takes a little bit more time for it to increase, despite us pushing out a little bit more power. We typically see a spike in the power output as we're trying to reach this target heart rate. It becomes a little bit harder. It's not really responding the way it usually does. And our perception of effort's up. It feels harder to ride at that heart rate compared to previously. This might just indicate acute fatigue, and maybe a day or 2 of rest, and they'll be good to go. And then the red one is really when basically the heart rate is not sluggish at all. We need way more power output to reach our target heart rate. Maybe we can't even reach the target heart rate in stage 3. And as a result, the perception of effort feels much harder. So I would say if you're anywhere in these two bottom lines over here, either a day or 2 of rest is probably a good idea, just to try and let the body recover. And again, that might be related to external stresses or a particularly high training load, and they're just struggling to get on top of that. So just a day or 2, maybe redo the test or a similar test that you're using, and then reevaluate from there. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Before we continue to the next question, those of you who are participating, please, you can start to post your questions in either the Facebook pages or on the Q&A page of the Zoom session. And we'll move on to the next question, which is directed at Mike Posthumus. What gains do you make from doing more work on hills versus on the flats? And would you want to vary this in training for different phases?
Okay, so sorry, I just had my order wrong. So this question again, I'm just asking whether it's better to perform intervals on hills or on flats. And this brought me to this study, which I thought would be great to share. And basically, in summary, I prefer hills. This is why. So in the study, they got people to do 2, or divided the participants of the study into 2 groups. One group performed the intervals only on hills. The other group performed their intervals only on flats. And these are the profiles of, on the bottom here, C and D, are the profiles of the roads used outside in which they performed their intervals on. And they performed 4 weeks of 6 by 5 minute intervals, 2 of these sessions a week. If we have a look now across at the findings of the study, you can see that the 100 group, it was performed under high cadence, but this is the group that performed it on a flat road. And on the right here is the group that performed it on a climb. You can see, firstly, if we look at the people that performed, the participants of the study that did their interval sessions on flat road, when you looked at a flat time trial, they only improved at a flat time trial. They didn't improve at an uphill time trial. Whereas those that performed their intervals on hills perform or increase their performance on both flat and incline time trials. So based off that data, I prefer prescribing uphills, because then you're going to be improving your performance on the ups and the flats. So that's a quick little answer to that question.
Thanks, Mike. The next question is directed at me, and that is, how much room for growth is there? Is the ceiling set by genetics, or can the ceiling be raised? And equally so, how soon after starting with a beginner is the coach likely to form an opinion? And I'm interested to hear what the science says and what experience has taught you. So the first thing that is important is that when we decide to evaluate someone has a big impact on what we will see. And so it's important never to use a short time duration or a single snapshot of somebody's development to make any inferences about their long-term ability. So for instance, here we have data from an individual and their development over time. This is from somebody who's actually started when they were just finishing their junior years and then moving up through the following almost a year and a half. And if we started with this individual here, we might have the erroneous impression that they are already incredibly talented and phenomenal and expect them to maybe go up to a higher level. And if we test them right at the beginning, and then we make the erroneous impression that they're not as talented as they are, we can make errors. So the key thing is to always look at progression over time when you've got somebody training optimally, giving the right training load and recovery, and then seeing how they're progressing over time. And that'll give you a good indicator of how well they're going to perform in the long run. Typically, we see this kind of curve where they start to plateau after a period of about 1.5 years to 2 years. And we typically see smaller increments in performance after the 3rd year. So the first 3 years where we start to do structured training with somebody and start to work on all the different components that they can add to performance, we will see the largest gains. And that's typically what I'll tell an athlete when I start with them. I'll tell them that, you know, unless they're already coming in from an elite level or a semi-elite level, typically I will tell them you're not going to see a peak in your performance until about year 3. What is important is to understand that training adaptations occur in all different systems around the body. So at each level, there are continuous training adaptations, and different training stimuli target different training adaptations. And so sometimes an athlete, even when they've already peaked or plateaued, they may at some later stage suddenly improve a significant number of percentage points and perform better because the training stimulus has suddenly changed. They move on to a new coach, or they discover something profound in terms of their own methods, and they realize that they can still improve things. And this is by no means complete. Even within certain aspects, for instance, within the muscle, there are various other adaptations, for instance, capillary density, monocarboxylate transporter numbers, and various other adaptations that can happen. A very important one that we always forget about is the central nervous system. We know that ultimately fatigue is really regulated by the brain in response to signals from all the different various organs and systems. And what we now know, based on the research that we've conducted in our unit and many other places around the world, is that there is actually an enormous capacity to still perform better. To give you an example, this is one of the studies that we did as part of my PhD, where we gave athletes, already highly trained athletes, so these were all elite cyclists, all with VO2 maxes over 65 and able to compete at a very high level. And when we gave them amphetamines, they increased their time to exhaustion by 32%, and they exercised at an 18% higher power output before reaching exhaustion. So much longer duration to exhaustion at a much higher power output. And that's obviously why the amphetamines are a prohibited substance. But you can see that there's a substantial physiological reserve when we think that we're already performing at our maximum. Another example of that is another paper that was published actually in the same issue of BJSM. And here we looked at what happens when somebody becomes more familiar with a particular effort. And in this case, it was a 40-kilometer time trial. And we brought them back on a week-to-week basis. We used the LSCT to make sure that they didn't change their training status. So their actual training status or their adaptation to the training load was the same. But yet, over a period of 4 trials, they improved by a total of 5.5%. So that shows you how much familiarity with the exercise bout can improve performance. And that's one of the key reasons why athletes who do, for instance, Grand Tour racing, go and reconnoiter some of the key climbs. If you can actually know exactly where the finish is, what that climb feels like in terms of the different gradients, and when you do a maximal effort on that climb, exactly how much effort you can put in before you get to the final kilometer, final 500 meters, you can unlock some additional performance. And to get 5.5% improvement out of training-related adaptations that are other non-central nervous system is very difficult to achieve. So don't underestimate the effects of the brain as well. And then we're going to move on to the next question, which is directed at John again. And the question is, I would like to know what your protocol is when you that you follow at altitude training camps, before, during, and after those training camps.
Thanks, Jeroen. Yeah, as you said, what protocols do we follow? It's quite an extensive answer this, so trying to cut it down as sort of short and as simple as possible is, prior to training camps, we obviously, from a training load on the athletes, they have a very easy load due to the fact, obviously, going to a camp, you going there to train. So when we start planning a camp is purely what is the objective of the camp, where the location of the camp is going to be. We'll look at weather, we'll look at obviously altitude. Typically, we want to from sleep at typically over 2,000 meters. If we can train lower during days is fine, but essentially we want to be sleeping at 2,000, 2,100 meters. The highest we'd want to sleep at is typically around 2.6, although we don't try stay there much unless it's really dependent on weather. And the duration of our camps, again, is based around what the objective is, being 10 or 21 days. Our training blocks that we do, or that I typically prescribe when we're there, are either 3 days on, 1 recovery, then the next block is 4 days on, 1 day off, and then we go 3 days on again and 1 day off, and we just keep on repeating that based on how everyone is adapting. In terms of training itself, the first 3 days is really easy, sort of 3.5 hours a day, and just really easy riding. The 4th day will typically go a bit longer. And the 5th day is when we'll typically do a key session, whether that's a low cadence neuromuscular, or what I like to prescribe specifically is a 4x15 minute effort during a ride. And the recovery between that is typically about 15 minutes each, 20 minutes. And your power output is anything between 90 to 100% of threshold. What we don't do at training camps at altitude typically are sort of anaerobic efforts and maximal efforts. The only way we would prescribe that is towards the end of the camp, and if we can go below 1,000 meters. If we can do that, we'll prescribe those, but it'll also be very, very limited. Another thing that we take into account really importantly is obviously power values, which will differ differently compared from sea level to wherever you are at altitude. We also use these when we go into races at certain times. Our colleague here, Reece, helped me with this document the one day when I was actually in Sierra Nevada. And typically with us being at the elevation meters here, we are always typically from, as I said, about 2,000, 2,200 meters. And with that, if you look on the top right of your screen here, this would be an acclimated, so pre-5 days, and then an acclimated threshold value. So this is what the athlete's threshold is going into the camp. And if we look at where he is, or during the camp, pre-acclimated, we would work off a value of anything from 320 to 325. And then once acclimated after 5 days, we'd look at anything from about 335 to 345. Going forward, our numbers will be prescribed off that. If they are slightly out, we'll adjust as the athlete gives us feedback. How do we monitor athletes at altitude? There's a number of ways that we do it. The one that we use, or two variables that we use a lot, is the pulse oximetry meter. It's a really simple, non-invasive way of testing. It's a probe that you would either attach to an ear or a finger lobe, a earlobe or a finger, and it reads the wavelengths of light reflected from the blood. You can see on this picture the athlete isn't really acclimated yet, and we look at between 96 and 100% as the athlete being acclimated and ready to go. Additionally, from that, the doctor that'll be with us at the camp, for argument's sake, if it's Jeroen, will, upon arrival or on the next day, if we get there late at night, we'll take a blood sample. And from that, it'll be taken every 7 days at the end of every week. And then additionally, at the end of the camp. From that side, Jeroen will obviously monitor, or the doctor on call will monitor it and get a profile, everything going. The other element is obviously training data and subjective feedback in terms of a wellness report, etc., and just straight communication. At the bottom over here is typically a daily chart of sort of what our training plan or our daily plan would be like going into a camp. It may change a little bit daily with sessions, etc., but that's a basic daily guideline. One thing that we do very watch very closely and insist on riders is additional iron supplementation, which we prescribe 100 milligrams a day. There's a study done by Dr. Andrew Gobus with regards to supplementation at altitude, and what it showed in summary was 100 milligrams of iron a day was enough to prevent ferritin dropping significantly, although it did drop at this during the altitude. 200 milligrams, when you increased it, actually made it go up. So this value was probably more than likely too much. So when I was at our last camp in South Africa, we were prescribing between 60 and 100 milligrams a day. It was noted that there was no difference in hemoglobin concentration after altitude with 100 and 200 milligrams. However, with no iron, it did show a significant drop. The question comes in, obviously, why do you go to altitude and when is the best time to go to altitude? This is Jan Polank, although it had been changed since COVID. This was his annual plan going into the year and going into Tour de France. So here he would have done 21 days at Silvestre in Sierra Nevada. This was also purely for our Tour de France team, which was also doing Dauphiné. What you do after being at altitude, you have a 5 to 7 day window that you would come down from altitude prior to a race for adaptation. You typically don't feel the best after being at altitude for that long. You would recover. Here he was going to Dauphiné to race. Then he was going back to Mont Genève. Here they were actually doing a recon on some of the Tour de France stages, but it was a top up essentially of going back to altitude. And then he was coming down again a week before and going straight to the Tour de France. What needs to be noted here is after the race at Dauphiné, which would have been a big load, the goal was essentially to win with Tadej Pogačar here. He would have been a bit smashed. So he would have recovered a week at home, and then, which is at sea level, and then gone to altitude. He wouldn't have gone from Dauphiné to altitude. His recovery there would have been significantly affected. So with that, he would have done 5 to 7 days at home, really light riding, and then gone back to altitude, done a route recon, got a top up of altitude, come back home, packed his clothes, kissed his girlfriend goodbye, and then gone off to the Tour de France for 25 days. And that is essentially the pattern that we follow and the monitoring systems that we follow for our altitude camps.
Thanks, John. We're going to have one last question from Reece, and then we're going to go to the floor and take your questions and answer them directly. And that question is, in periodized training, when they talk about an easy day, how easy is easy, Reece?
Thanks, Jeroen. Okay, so I know Mike has touched on periodization already. I'm just going to give a very quick intro before I delve into the exact question. So, of course, we've been given a description of what periodization is, and essentially it's breaking your annual training plan up into specific blocks, of which you can obviously control volume and intensity and also frequency. So just to go into these quickly, I'm just going to bring my laser pointer up here. We generally start out with or use 5 blocks. You have your strength block, base, transition, peak, and taper. And then, of course, at the end of the day, you want to race. During these phases, there's, of course, a difference in volume and intensity. And these phases are separated by recovery weeks. So within each block, there's, of course, easy or recovery days. And then between each block, there are recovery days. So I'm of a firm believer that, of course, what you want from your easy day is going to differ here compared to here. So essentially what we obviously experience is an increase in volume during our base, which is why this block's bigger, and then a decrease in volume gradually to the event. Of course, a lot more is happening here than just a simple flat block, but our intensity would increase throughout. As Mike said, increasing intensity is probably the way you want to go. And then going into exactly how easy is easy, generally, you probably want to be fully recovered within 48 to 72 hours after a demanding session. Of course, this is very dependent on your current training block and status. If you've just done a massive amount of training and are incredibly fatigued, your recovery will differ quite a bit. And also, if you're an incredibly conditioned athlete or experienced athlete compared to a novice, your training status will be dramatically different. And of course, that would also affect your recovery rate. And then the second question you need to ask yourself is, what is the next session? So how recovered do you actually need to be? During your recovery week, so this is between blocks, do you need to be absolutely fresh during the middle, or do you want to be fresh at the end? And of course, if you're in your block, how do you want to recover from that next session to the next session? Of course you do. So how recovered do you want to be? And that's what will kind of dictate how easy you want your session to be. The main thing that this comes down to is actually having correct training zones. So are your individual intensities correct? There's no point in doing a recovery ride and looking at, for instance, power or heart rate data if these zones are wrong. So I would suggest obviously making sure that your intensities and zones are correct through even a simple peak power output test or VO2 max test. And in addition to this, some simple methods you can use when you are training is session RPE. So generally an RPE of 2 to 3 out of 10 is probably relatively pretty easy, and I would suggest that should be enough. If you're using power or heart rate, zone 1 or low zone 2 is generally what is prescribed. And then of course, if you're riding on intensity factor as well. So if you're using your power meter and you have an intensity factor on your screen, your head unit screen, keeping between probably 0.5 and 0.6 is generally should allow enough, be easy enough that you will be recovering. Of course, at the end of the day, and this is what I like to probably use, is can you actually talk? So it's a nice way to just take all of these variables into account, you know. Can you hold a proper conversation? If you're riding in zone 1 or your RPE is low, but you're still out of breath, you know, maybe you should tap off. So I think it's a nice way just to tie all of those together. And, you know, training easy should be easy, but obviously not so easy that you're not doing anything. So hopefully that provided some information and some simple tips that you can use to assess if you're training easy enough, and if you are using a periodized approach, how to incorporate this. So as mentioned, if you're within a block, you probably don't need to do incredibly easy sessions in an entire recovery week. You probably could be a little bit harder, maybe a 3 or 4 on RPE, for example, but obviously that's dependent if you have a coach prescribing intervals or sessions. So yeah, that's my answer.
Right, thank you, Reece. We're now going to move to questions from the floor, and I'm going to read out the questions, and then I'm going to assign somebody to answer that. If one of our delegates would prefer to answer that, then please just unmute yourself and let us know. The first question is, if one is training for marathon cycling events, I'm just a regular rider, no podiums, is there any guidance on how many days a week one should be training as a ballpark? I'm going to hand that one over to John, unless somebody else is dying to answer that one. John, can you give us some insight?
Yeah, this is really a bit of a personal answer. Is A, how much time have you got available to you, and work it around that. I wouldn't say that you have to do 6 days a week and 15 hours. It's whatever you can do, get the time in, and if it is limited time, make sure that it's not wasted time. So make sure that your training sessions have a purpose, whether it's a recovery session or whether it's a key session or whether it's a long ride. Whatever it is, just go out and ride with a purpose, so it's not a wasted session. If I had to give you a definite answer, I would say to you probably 5 days a week is what would be your sufficient number.
Thanks, John. Cool. Question from Shivan Arrowhawk. What are your takes on sleep nutrition? Intake of protein before sleep, is that helpful or not? Ben, I think this is probably one that you could answer best. Why don't you give it a go?
Sure, thanks, Doc. So yeah, great question. So the protein intake is that you're speaking to, Shivan, I think is related to the idea that if, particularly after a hard session, if you take a single bolus of a high protein meal just before you go to bed, the sort of rationale behind that thought process is that you've got all these amino acids available to you whilst you are sleeping. So if you think about sleep, if you're, asleep for 8 hours, ideally, that's a long period when you're not getting any fuel or nutrition in. So if you've had a particularly rough day in terms of your training, taking a protein bolus of usually good quality whey protein just before you go to bed has been shown to be beneficial, mainly to increasing strength adaptation, so muscle protein synthesis, and then obviously recovery from a hard session as well. So it's not a bad idea to experiment with that if you're interested.
Thanks, Ben. The third question is, does the panel see any benefit in using heart rate variability as a tool for monitoring an athlete's response to training load and recovery or general lifestyle stresses? Mike, I think this is one for you to answer, so go ahead.
Thanks for the question. So do I find value in using it as a tool? So the key there is tool. Yes, it is a tool. It's never going to be a definitive yes or no. And I think quite often this is the mistake athletes make. So if it's interpreted by a coach that knows what he's looking at, I believe there can be value added to it. And it is a tool that the coach can use to evaluate training load, as is wellness factors and several of these other factors. So yes, when the coach is able to evaluate that data, it can be very informative. There are ever dangers, and I've found with several athletes, they're currently wearing this device and the device is flashing red and it puts them off and affects their psychological state. So just a warning to you, if you are using these devices, to remember that it is a valuable tool. It isn't a yes or no, and quite often it can be wrong as well. I've been wearing a certain device for the past 5 months, and I've found several days where it might show red and I'm feeling absolutely fantastic, and sometimes completely opposite way around. But interpreted as one of the possible tools we can use. Yes, there could potentially be benefit, but be careful to not overinterpret it.
Thanks, Mike. Devin asked, hi guys, if a 16-week plan, 4 mesocycles, 3 weeks on, 1 week off, is geared towards improving an athlete's PPO, how would the key sessions in the first 2 phases, general prep and base, differ from training towards a goal of increased neuromuscular power or increased threshold, for instance? Are the sessions done in those initial phases very generic, or can they be more specifically tailored as foundational sessions to the more specialized intervals to come later in the macro cycle? So I think between John and Mike, they like to mess around with developing training sessions. So I'll let John answer half and Mike can answer half if you've got more to add, Mike. But John, you can kick off with an answer to that one.
John can start.
Okay, sure. Mike, you can start. You can start. I'll follow up with you.
So I'll start speaking broadly. So broadly speaking, I think what Devin's asking is, we do know there are 4 phases. In our first 2, do we keep them generic? And I think, yes, I do. So no matter if I'm training somebody for an ultra marathon race or somebody that is a crit racer, these initial phases I do keep very similar. So in the initial phase, what we call our general prep phase, I always do talk, and the talk sessions are always very similar. I like my 6 by 4 minute interval sessions. I like including a few what I call Hopkins sessions, where you do talk sprints, sort of mixing them up a little bit and moving into some longer talk efforts, now talking sort of 3 by 10 minutes of talk intervals. That is the first general prep phase. Rest, and then that second base phase, everybody's going to be doing similar work, because what we are doing here is increasing mitochondrial density. We're increasing lactate utilization and lactate shuttling, and this is a benefit to everybody, no matter what they eventually go into. So during this session, I like doing sort of 5 by 10 minutes, for example, at or just below some threshold. So not too hard, but I do still include a little bit of intensity in that. So those 2 phases are very generic, and everyone will be doing very similar work during that phase. It's the second half where it gets spicy. And when I say spicy, there we start becoming more specific. So there my intervals try and mimic the competition. So you start increasing your specificity. And that's, for those of you that have been following, sort of John and I often have fun, a little bit of banter about these sessions. But really what we're doing there, those are the final two phases where we try and increase the specificity. And John, I don't know if you've got anything else to add.
Yeah, so from my side, and this is coming kind of now really recently, this year a bit, is I've literally gone from that strength and neuromuscular set of, as Mike said, 6x4s, 3x10s. But what I'd started doing within that, even on the session, so if I prescribed a 6x4, I'd also every now and again prescribed a set of 40-20s, which is, as you know, it would be your competition phase. So I've started experimenting a little bit kind of earlier in the phases with that. So I'd done, you know, as I said, like 6x4s, and then ended off that session of low cadence and ended that session with a set of 10x40-20s. Another one I had also done, being a 8x4 set, would be alternated between either a 4-minute low cadence and a 4-minute threshold set, or a 4-minute low cadence set and followed by 4 minutes all out. As it stands right now, I don't have a lot of data to tell you later on in the phases whether that's going to be of any benefit, but I have started experimenting a little bit with that now. Maybe if we have a webinar at the end of the year, I can give you more kind of feedback on that. But as Mike said, those two phases essentially stay the same. And then when it comes to more specificity is where it kind of starts getting real. And again, depending on the discipline, there's everything relatively stays the same, except for maybe a 5% difference, where if it's a road rider, I'll head off a little bit with these type of sessions. If it's a cross-country person, that type of session, but it's really a very small 5% variance. But a big change I've made now is in that base prep phase.
John, if I can just add to that and then basically just highlight exactly what you've said now, is that, you know, in your traditional periodization approach, especially if each of the mesocycles is particularly long, you run the risk of losing some of the training adaptations that you've had in the previous mesocycles. So if you do, for instance, a strength mesocycle, and by the time you get to your competition, that was 4 or 5 months ago or 3 months ago, you may have lost a lot of that adaptation. So I think there's a lot of merit in mixing up some of your mesocycles, and you're moving more towards your type of block periodization type of training prescription, which is what I tend to do with a lot of my athletes now, is do very much shorter mesocycles and do repetitive sort of mini macrocycles. And yes, that way they can keep getting the stimulus from each of those different training sessions throughout their build-up. There's obviously a difference between each of those mini macrocycles. As we get closer to a big competition, the high intensity aspect takes a much bigger role, but at least we continue to do some of those sessions and continue that adaptive process, or maintain that adaptive process. And I think that's one of the key things that I think we've changed to doing in recent years. I think we all do the same. Right, so we're moving on to the next question from Bruno Noguera, who said, do you guys recommend any supplements like beta-alanine? And I think I can probably answer that one. Well, if we look at supplementation in sport in general, and we look at the research behind various different macro and micronutrients, what we actually find is that there are actually a very short list of substances which are ergogenic, or have been definitively shown by independent peer-reviewed research to be ergogenic and to improve performance. And if I go down the list in terms of the ones that are most ergogenic to least ergogenic, we can start with carbohydrate. The single most important supplement that you can take for exercise performance is carbohydrate. Moving on from carbohydrate, the next one that everybody uses, or nearly everybody uses, is caffeine. Caffeine is incredibly ergogenic when used in the right concentrations. And so caffeine is widely used and has been supported by an absolute plethora of literature. Moving on from there, we move on to protein. Protein in recovery. protein during sessions if you're doing stage racing or very hard training blocks. And there's a lot of good evidence to show that protein enhances performance in subsequent exercise bouts. So in other words, it improves your recovery and your adaptation to training. And then we move on to micronutrients. And there the list gets very short and the evidence starts to become less clear. And one of those is beta-alanine. And beta-alanine is probably the one micronutrient that has the most evidence behind it in terms of its ergogenic capacity. It was all the rage about 5 to 10 years ago, and pretty much every athlete was taking beta-alanine. For some reason, just in terms of my own subjective perception, I'm not seeing that many athletes asking questions about beta-alanine or necessarily telling me that they're taking beta-alanine. But in terms of the science, about 2/3 of all studies show that beta-alanine is ergogenic. So for those of you who don't know what beta-alanine is, it's basically a amino acid, and you take a particular dose as a loading dose initially, and then you taper off and have a maintenance dose, much like you do with creatine. So that brings us to the next one. And beta-alanine enhances repetitive sprint performance after endurance efforts. So it's particularly good for type of riding like cross-country mountain biking or road cycling, where you've got to do high intensity efforts subsequent to doing a prolonged endurance bout at a high intensity. The one that I mentioned there was creatine. Creatine is also very ergogenic, but it's limited. It works very well for events that are very short, high intensity events, obviously because creatine phosphate is the energy supply molecule in very short, high intensity efforts, like a 10-second or 20-second sprint. The problem with creatine is sometimes it results in weight gain. So in weight-bearing sport or sports where power to weight is very important, like cycling and running, for instance, creatine can have a sort of a balanced effect where the benefit is offset by the increased mass. And so it's not widely used in endurance sports, but it's definitely used in track cycling and swimming and other things like track and field in the sprint events. And that pretty much is the list. Phosphates are in a number of studies shown to be beneficial in improving peak power output, but the evidence there starts to get a bit sketchy. And after that, it disappears. So that's pretty much the comprehensive list of substances that can enhance performance and have been shown relatively definitively by science to do that. Anybody else want to add anything on nutrition?
Doc, can I just add something to that? Just in terms of, it's obviously a very general message, but just in terms of supplementation, even if it's something as sort of innocent as caffeine, if you getting out there and sourcing it, just make sure that it comes from a reputable source or something where it's the chance of contamination and you may be getting a little bit more than just caffeine in there. So just be careful when you are purchasing supplements like that, especially things like caffeine, beta-alanine, etc.
Absolutely. Yep. Risk of contamination or mislabeling in the process can result in a adverse analytical finding in a doping control. So be careful what you use and stick to reputable sources. Kevin van Hoevels asked, what is the advice for training during these long periods without any competition? Do we focus on base training, or are we also focusing on intensity? And so, Reece, I'm going to hand that one to you to answer. And if anybody else wants to add anything to after Reece, they're welcome to. Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks, Jeroen. Yeah, so I think there are a number of factors to consider here. Firstly, it depends where you currently were in your training phase. What I would suggest is probably sort of starting not from scratch, but building up through the correct phases, as racing might be quite a while away. So strength work is obviously very important, talk, neuromuscular work. I don't think that base means that there's no intensity. So understand that you can still be doing intensity. It doesn't have to be obviously max. You can still be doing intensity while you're building up your volume. But some suggestions I'd probably give you to keep yourself competitive during this period is to maybe set yourself some goals. So testing, for instance, a peak power output test, set 1-2 months away, go through some training phases, and then hit that test out and see how that goes. And also working on weaknesses. So if there's a particular area where you normally struggle in racing, use this time now to sort of build that up and try and improve that area. And then also scouting or looking at races that you probably will be doing, seeing which efforts are required, and then thinking, okay, if there's a lot of short, hard climbs, maybe those are the type of efforts I should be building up towards, and just making sure that you're building your capacity in that regard. So I think that's kind of, in a nutshell, what I would suggest.
Thanks, Reece. Has anybody got anything that they want to add to that?
And another point could be is actually taking your season break right now and taking off, whether that's a week, 2 weeks, 10 days. You know, if you look at where the calendar is, whether it's road or mountain bike, you're only looking at stuff maybe in end of September, October, possibly, is where I personally think. So when that does happen, are you going to be racing essentially to December and then start again in January, or do you finish in November and start again prepping for the new season in December? If that's the case, it's mentally quite tough, and the calendar is more than likely congested. So take off now and you run your year just slightly different. You know, so that's also another option, is just totally get off the gas, sit on the couch, eat cookies, and then start training again.
I think I'd add to that as well.
Yeah.
Just to be careful of, particularly during this period of training monotony. So guys doing the same sessions day in, day out, or week in, week out. I guess from a logical point of view, it does sort of make sense that you don't want to be chasing form now when you have no idea when the race season is going to start. But at the same time, you know, the important thing is to keep athletes motivated during this period. So you don't want to just be giving them the same types of sessions over, you know, the sort of indefinite period, however long it lasts, wherever you are. So, you know, throw in some new sessions, keep it fun, maybe the odd sort of Zwift race or something like that, just to make it a little bit different. But just be aware of that training monotony where you know, they could potentially also just develop a bit of staleness to the whole thing and get a bit over it.
Yeah, I think I can just also add. Yeah, I can just also add sort of what my approach has been. I think everybody can realize that there isn't really a right or wrong at this stage. But myself, I've been sort of including a lot of strength work, as everybody have, on bike and off bike. So important off bike. This is an important stage now where you can really emphasize some strength work. So get in the gym, get strong. It certainly will help you later in the season. Been obviously doing a lot of talk intervals. And then you mentioned base. I've also been sort of trying to get athletes to do some longer hours during this phase, because again, I don't see much point in really pushing intensity right now. So just trying to build those foundations through trying to get longer hours, especially because majority of these hours are in the indoor trainer. There's going to be a lot of benefit gained from just setting those longer hours on the indoor trainer. And I've already seen, I've got athletes that have been doing longer weeks, up to 20 weeks, just sitting on the indoor trainer, and they're absolutely blown away that a lot of them are hitting PBs when they do go and race. And that's the third component, have fun. So I've been encouraging athletes just to go have fun, race if they want to race. If they want to do something stupid, I've had a few athletes wanting to do an Everesting, go for it. There's nothing holding you back. Anything to keep them motivated at this stage.
Thanks, Mike. I'm not going to add anything to that, because I've got nothing further to contribute to that discussion. But we're already 5 minutes over our allotted time and counting, and I think we've run out of questions. So I think that's probably the cue to end this next webinar. And I want to thank everybody who's attended for coming and listening to us. I want to thank our delegates for their contribution. Thank you, guys, for making yourselves available to give all this info over to the various delegates who attended. So I think the webinars have been a great success, and you can look to us continuing them, maybe next week, maybe in a little while. We'll have to confirm. But thank you, everybody, for coming to this one, and we look forward to seeing you in future. Goodbye, everybody.